Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Happy to be joined today by Josh Blank, research director for the Texas Politics Project. Top of the morning, Josh.
Good morning.
Nice. I mean, it's going to be hot this afternoon, but a nice fall morning.
Yeah, I mean that's
Austin
very
standards.
It's very generous.
Well, it was nice earlier. Let's put it that way.
Not to be like the weather thing, but like it's so crazy right now, like how beautiful it is in the shade and how unbearable it is in the sun. Like it's just
there's something metaphoric about that. I think. Maybe.
I guess so.
So, today we thought that we would circle back, and we haven't really done a whole podcast on the Senate race, although we've, been touching on it as the polling. We've done the periodic poll releases in that race and commented on the evolution of that race. So today we thought we'd take a closer look at the U.S. Senate race in Texas between incumbent Ted Cruz and his challenger, three-term Congressman Colin Allred of Dallas. The candidates will have their only debate on Tuesday, October 15th, which is, for at least some people in Texas, must-see TV. Mm-hmm. And the race more recently has been getting national attention. And I think if you look at the larger context of this, part of it is the national fight over the Senate, where Democrats nationally have a one-seat majority. They're at a disadvantage nationally in that they are defending more seats this cycle than Republicans are, given the staggered nature of Senate elections in between censuses or censi. And just in the last few weeks, a lot more increased attention to Texas as some of the key Democrats are struggling. I think most people are writing off John Tester in Montana. Sherrod Brown, I think, is running a little stronger in Ohio. But there are, a handful of these Senate seats, people are in trouble and Democrats are beginning to see the writing on the wall. And, as somebody recently was pointing out in something we saw, I guess it was our colleague Sean Theriot yesterday in a thing in the government department, among other people, pointing out that actually Allred looks closer to Cruz in the polls right now than Tester is to his Republican opponent in Montana. And so there's an understandable kind of rational shift to reconsidering what's going on in Texas, what's going on with Senator Rick Scott in Florida. And that's kind of setting this up.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, it's interesting. I mean, in some ways, one of the things that makes Texas unique, and I mean, again, to your point, one of our other colleagues who we have on the podcast regularly, Darren Shaw, was doing a presentation yesterday as well. And you're looking at sort of the partisan leans of the various states. And the reality is Texas is not really kind of far outside of the middle, when you kind of look at what we think of as competitive states. The issue with states like Texas and Florida is that, it's no small amount of resources once you decide you want to be competitive. So in some ways, Texas could be more competitive, in terms of like the partisan lean than some other states. And there could still be reticence to spend money here. I think right now what you're seeing is that as Democrats, two things, right? One, as Democrats are writing off states that, essentially they kind of needed to win, but that would be less expensive to campaign in. But I think on the heels of certainly huge fundraising numbers, especially at the national level, now they're sort of turning this money to where they can, and Texas is one of the recipients, it seems, of that.
Yeah, I mean, we're at a familiar point in the cycle where parties are trying to figure out where they're going to place their last couple rounds of bets.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where, the worst thing than placing the wrong bets is not placing bets, because if you want to see people mad, it's when they don't spend the money, right? And that's the thing. I mean, I think, what you're seeing is that, as other groups are starting to pay more attention to Texas, I mean, one of the things, having been here for a long time, you kind of go, $10 million is, it's a lot of money, but how much is it really? Like in a state like this, it's kind of like, you're like, it's,
As people have, pointed out, we're certainly not for, whether it's 1 million or 10 million, it goes a lot farther in Montana than it does
Yeah,
in Texas.
exactly.
Right. So,
And if anything, it shows the desperation of Democrats and their Senate hopes that now they're kind of moving in this direction.
yeah, the price of doing business here is always, more expensive, is higher.
Right.
Not in all things. I don't want to hear from the governor's office, but comes to politics, certainly
Right.
the price of doing business here a lot higher. So, a little, let's delve a little into the background before we look at the current. So, obviously the big benchmark here, for better and for worse, and we want to talk about that for a few minutes, is Ted Cruz's last race in 2018, where he narrowly beat Beto O'Rourke, 2.58%. Cruz won by 215,000 votes. And I think, this election is, we talk about interpretation a lot, and that's not quite the right way to describe this, but the level of interpretation that goes on and how people are attaching meaning to this election varies a lot, and it's a complicated thing to some degree, I think. It's fair to say.
I think that's right. I mean, I get a lot of questions about, whether or not, this race is going to be competitive, whether Allred can do it, whatever the way the question is formed. And I think one of the things about, Cruz's 2018 race, and I've been thinking about this as sort of discussion question that we can talk about a little bit now, is like, is that really fair? Is that really the fair point of comparison? And we'll talk about sort of why, I think Cruz sort of has this fixed space in people's minds, but I'll just put this point out there. Right. In that same election, right, which was a very tough year for Republicans across the board.
And for structural reasons.
For structural reasons. Yeah.
Not only in Texas, but everywhere.
That's right. I mean, nationally. That was not that was a Democratic year. We don't need to go into the details there. Most of you probably know that. But, while Cruz won his race by 215,000, I think a lot of people sort of automatically say to themselves, well, that's pretty close to zero. Right? I mean, you're almost looking past it to say, well, how much further would Democrats need to get? In that same election, again, very different candidate, very different race, but Greg Abbott won by over 1 million votes. Same election, 2018, same year, same structural factors. Again, different candidates, different, fundraising, all that kind of stuff. But the point is there were a lot more Republican votes out there to pick up, or at least potentially Republican-leaning voters, and Abbott got them, right? And so, and you can sort of look at all the races since then that are top of the ticket races. So again, that same year, Abbott won by 1.1 million. You go ahead to 2020, we kind of come to this, but Trump won by 630,000 votes, so another 400,000 votes on top of what, Cruz did. Cornyn won by over 1 million. Abbott won in 22 by 880,000 votes. So this is all just to say, yes, 215,000 is close to zero. Right, in terms of
closer than 600,000, objectively speaking.
Right, yeah. But there's no indication that those voters exist yet, and that's just the point I'm making. Is when you look at the whole scope of the elections that we've seen, I'd say that maybe Cruz underperformed, but underperformed means that there's somewhere to go.
Yeah, and to the point that there was a lot going on that year. The attorney general and lieutenant governor's races were pretty close that year too. Compared to the usual baseline.
Right, compared to the usual baseline.
Right, and compared to what, how well Abbott did. There's probably a little side point there. Candidates matter.
Yeah,
right?
Candidates.
In that, Governor Abbott had an unusually weak candidate opponent that year. Mm-hmm. The attorney general's race, Attorney General Paxton, even back then, had some issues that, probably weakened some level, his support at some level. Had a savvy candidate, if untested at the time, in Justin Nelson. And I think somebody, who ran an unusually strong race at that level of the ballot for the Democrats.
Yeah.
So, there were things going on there. I think one of the funny things that's hard to kind of reason through on this, is the conviction out there, and it's stronger among Democrats, but, I've also had a lot of, reporters, other people kind of start the conversation. Well, everybody kind of hates Ted Cruz.
Yeah.
He's very unpopular, and
it's remarkable how many conversations with people who should know better start that
really
way.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's interesting, and, he's unpopular, he's unlikable, therefore he's vulnerable.
Right.
And look, that's true of Democrats, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in our most recent polling, 82% of Democrats had an unfavorable view of Cruz, 73% very unfavorable, 80% disapprove of the job he's doing, 71% strongly, and that's pretty common. But this is the thing. It's not just it's not just the direction. it's the intensity. But this is really like a Democratic thing.
Yeah, and look, there's not absolutely nothing there. If you look at the trajectory of Cruz's career, there have been interesting phases to Ted Cruz's career. And, it seems like a long time ago. But, when you think back to when Ted Cruz won the nomination in 2012 out of a very crowded field, he was rightly seen as a sign of, the ascendance of the Tea Party wave within the Texas GOP and in the state overall. He defeated Lieutenant Governor David Dewhurst. Well-funded, and in many ways, was, ran as kind of a known quantity and a quasi-incumbent, and I think that, it was a sign of Cruz's rise was, a sign of, the ascendancy, as I've said, of this Tea Party. But it was also, exposed, was the first phase of exposing David Dewhurst as, not a particularly strong candidate and somebody who had kind of a glide path in. And once it got hard, actually turned out to not run very well. And, that was the other shoe dropping on that was when Dewhurst lost that Senate primary. He ran in 2014 again and was to be reelected lieutenant governor, and then lost in that primary to none other than Dan Patrick.
Right.
Talking about the other shoe kind of dropping in terms of this internal shift inside the Texas GOP.
He has an interesting footnote for
Dewhurst, a role in the ascension of probably the two most prominent figures that came out of the Tea Party shift in the GOP. So, and then, and Cruz ran with that. And again, we were talking about 2018 and what the mood of that moment was. When Ted Cruz goes to the Senate in 2013, Obama's second term, he establishes an image that he is now, to jump ahead, obviously trying to dilute a little bit or sort of rebrand to some degree, at least with the broader niche in the electorate. I mean, his initial approach to being a senator was to be disruptive, was to be an outsider. And, I think I think he actually built on the whole, nobody likes Ted Cruz thing, because the argument was, because I'm not one of them. Yeah,
I think the term of art, to my mind at the time, or the word that sticks with me was, insurgent. This idea that there was an insurgency. And one of the notable things about an insurgent is that, you're not there to work with the government.
Right. And there were, at the time, there were, I use this term, and I try not to use it, but sometimes it just fits. There was some PAC journalism that went on at the time. There were a million stories about how his new colleagues kind of hated him, and he didn't mind. And that included no small number of Republicans at the time because, he was so dedicated to being a bomb thrower and a disruptor, and that was his brand.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I'm reinforcing your point here, and I think I'm both kicking the press and giving them a pass, or I don't even know here, but it's also like, he had no problem with that. I'd say, I don't think at that point in time, the PAC journalism that showed Cruz as being an outsider was a problem for him either, right? But
I think they enjoyed the hook of
everybody
I kind of
hates him,
vaguely remember a headline like, nobody likes Ted Cruz or something.
Yeah, and I think, this reminds me a little bit more even at the time, because when this started, it's funny, it wasn't that long ago, and yet it feels so long ago in certain ways, right? And like, this was the time when, you might have said, I'm going to take this from you, it's like, oh, so the New York Times is writing that nobody likes you as a senator from Texas. Like, you're like, great, that's amazing.
Yeah, that's really tough for you.
Yeah.
You're really showing him, New York Times.
Yeah, and again, now, obviously, fast forward ahead, and this year's in the media is so much fragmented, it's so a different environment, but at that point in time, you'd almost take them and say, oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for that.
Right. And so if we follow his trajectory, and we've got a really, kind of telling, a really good, useful, if, kind of monstrous graphic that looks at Cruz's favorability ratings and his job approval ratings, over a long period of time. And, that worked for him among Republican voters, given where the Republican voters in Texas, given where the party was at the time and where it was headed.
Yeah, he enters, office essentially, at about a little under 70% favorability rating among Republican voters, and then just climbs up to about 80% over the course of the next couple of years, really, in a lot of ways, only to be dented by his own decision to run for president in 2016 and stay in.
Right. And there's a certain, this is not entirely fair, but, you're you're about 75% of being able to say, hoist upon your own petard here.
Yeah.
Because then Donald Trump comes as, look, what are the terms we've used, for Ted Cruz? Insurgent,
right?
Bomb thrower, and then he winds up challenging meeting Donald Trump in the 2016 primary, and it's one of the periods where you see his favorability numbers in Texas dip because of the way that the 2016 primary plays out, not just the negative attacks by Trump on Cruz, but also Cruz not giving in early.
Yeah.
And, dragging his feet and accepting Trump as the nominee at the convention. And, the dip in his job approval ratings and his favorability ratings among both Republican overall in Texas and among Republicans is very clear during that period.
Yeah, I mean, again, he was as high in June of 2014, he was as high as 80% favorable ratings among Republicans. And by June of 2016, kind of in the middle of this, he went down to 55%.
Right. But his numbers then, he takes another little dip during, the unfortunate vacation choice during Winter Storm Uri. But he's recovered more or less since then. He's not come back to his previous heights, but he's
pretty close, though.
Pretty close, though, in the high 70s.
Yeah, he's in the high 70s.
Mid to high 70s, consistent among Republicans.
And that's right. And the thing is being, so a couple things. One, I mean, just to add to that primary piece, I mean, one of the sort of shocking things about the 2016 primaries was that anybody was going to outflank Cruz on immigration, and Trump did that. So in addition to sort of, I think, the fact that he was dealing with all the negative barbs from Trump, he also wasn't able to distinguish himself in the way that he really probably had a strength, which was on this sort of singular issue of immigration, which Trump basically took. And I mean, so a lot of things going on there. I mean, how did he end up recovering from all this? Well, one, he basically made up, right, with Trump. And then ultimately he became one of his, big defenders, both, in terms of the election, but also during the impeachment, really notably in a way that's kind of come back around in this campaign in a bunch of interesting ways with his podcast where he was doing these sort of nightly podcasts during the impeachment. And then has continued on with these in a way that's given him a really direct line to a lot of his most committed supporters.
Yeah. And it's been, it's not. I mean, look, it was a smart move. It's worked for him. Yeah. Not rocket science, but still.
Says us.
Yeah, but, yes, as we, start a podcast.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, it proved helpful for him. And, as we look at his favorability, in particular his job approval numbers, he's been, skirting, I think, in kind of net positive territory overall.
Yeah, which, I mean, again, in Texas,
that's kind of a achievement for somebody where, and kind of, moves against the Democratic argument that everybody hates.
Well, that's the thing. That's where it really flies in the face.
That's kind of where you land this plane.
Yeah, that's where you fly in the face of this whole idea that, like, everybody hates Ted Cruz, but his job approval numbers look pretty okay for anybody in a competitive state. It's like, well, then I guess that's not true. Right.
So then we look at Colin Allred, right? And Colin Allred, very different story in the sense of, a much more recent entrant and still entering into Texas, the mental real estate and political awareness of Texans.
Right.
And that's really, to my mind, the big part of the Allred story up to Labor Day.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at our polling, in August of last year, 64% of voters couldn't offer an impression of Allred either way, favorable, unfavorable, anything. And that's been cut in half by August of this year. It's down to 32%, right? And so that's the work of campaigning. This is the expense of Texas. This is the difficulty. Now, what is that made up of? It's a mix, right? It's a lot of Democrats sort of learning who he is and most likely forming positive opinions of him. And it's also Republicans forming negative opinions of him because that's what the campaigns, are about. But ultimately, this has been, this is sort of the difficulty. I think for Democrats always is that, somebody jumps in the race, they look like an okay candidate, and then everybody complains that they're not doing enough, for months and months and months and months. And, honestly, this is the stuff that actually these candidates need to do, is they need to show up in, at the college campuses. They need to go to the Democratic clubs. They need to do the kind of stuff that essentially...
It doesn't move the big public needle.
No, it doesn't move the big public. And I think part of this, too, this goes back, we're not, this kind of goes back to the O'Rourke thing. And again, it goes back to people's expectations. It's like, if you're waiting for Colin Allred to, do an ollie on a skateboard in the Whataburger parking lot, you're probably going to have to keep waiting, right? Like, that's just not something that most candidates can do. That was one of the things, of all the things that I think O'Rourke unfairly gets credit for. He does fairly get credit for creating his own media moments, based on his instincts, I think, during that campaign in a way that I think really worked for him. But that's not normal, right? Most people just need to grind it out, right?
Yeah, use ollie and grind. In the
you
same,
like that? Yeah.
Look at this. You grew up in New York.
I grew up in New York, man.
And I meant that as a guy that, where skateboarding was invented in California, really, I think.
Yeah.
So anyway,
okay.
But I digress. I think that, the story of, kind of watching Allred and watching, this contrast with 2018 and O'Rourke, it also raises this issue of, the big perpetual Democratic dilemma and the decision that Allred made with the support of national Democrats in terms of this perpetual question: do you run to the left or do you run to the center left? Or even if the Allred campaign probably doesn't even want to call it the center left.
Yeah,
I don't think.
Want to call that.
But they made clearly an early commitment to a certain strategy here, which I would summarize as I am progressive enough, but basically moderate.
Yeah.
And, they've stuck to that.
Yeah. And I mean, it's hard not to look at this and assume that part of this is, learning, a reaction to prior campaigns. Because, there's one thing that you kind of know. If you go into the election, whether it's in Texas or somewhere else, the Republican messaging as it relates to the Democratic candidate is that this candidate is the most liberal person you've ever seen in your life. And we kind of joked about this before. It really doesn't matter who the candidate is, right? It could be Bill White. It could be Barack Obama. It could be Beto O'Rourke, right? It doesn't make a difference. This is the most liberal candidate you've ever seen, on the face of the earth.
Right.
And so I think in some ways, Democrats always have a hard time with, it's like, well, and I think this is tough within the party and this is partially also within the financial universe of the party, right? Do you embrace this idea that, well, Texas is really this progressive place. We just need to excite those progressive voters to turn out. And so therefore, if we give them this vision, they'll show up, even though they never have. Right. And the flip side is, well, if we know what their strategy is and we walk into that strategy, how's it worked out for us so far? And the answer is not very well. And so you are seeing a movement here. I think, you're seeing this reflected at the national level a little bit too. This is one of those, I don't really know how much of this is local versus national. And I'm thinking about the immigration issue here in particular, because you're seeing national Democrats really moderate. Moderate's an interesting word there. I'm not sure if that's even right. But let's just say take more aggressive stances on immigration policy than they have in the past. And we talked about this in this podcast, and that's clearly a reflection of, I think something that's going on in the electorate. It's going on with Democratic voters. And clearly, if it's going on with Democratic voters like in Ohio, it's going on here even more so. And so I think Allred was really quick to jump on that. But it is one of those things where, until the Democrats win an election, you're just like, well, we'll see how this works.
So how is this all shaking out? Look, what we're seeing now in the most recent polling is this race, tightening. It's been... we had the race at 8 among registered voters in the last week of August. And I think, I haven't looked directly at the timing of all the ad buys, but my sense is, the Allred ad buys in the state were beginning to increase and then really ramped up after that.
Yeah.
Right. Probably was ramping up as we were in the field in the last, 10 days in August, 10 days in August. And during and after Labor Day, it's just cranked up as I've been going around doing talks in different parts of the state. My audience participation, trick has been, okay, you can admit it, no judgment, raise your hand if you watch cable news or, any kind of network news. And, people kind of reluctantly have to go, no one's going to shame you. You can admit it. And, in the trade groups I've been talking to, it's slightly old, median age is probably older than like the talk in the government department yesterday, the panel in the government department yesterday. And you get a lot of people raising their hands. I say, okay, keep your hand up if you've seen a Colin Allred ad.
Right.
I had a couple of people raise their hand, raise their other hand up because they've seen so many. Now, the Cruz campaign is also cranking up their advertising and you get that back. But at this point, the purposes of that original, certainly that initial round of intro ads by the Allred campaign. Yeah. The one that had them there with, I think it came up last week or the week before with, uniformed law enforcement and, the message on the screen saying, with the voiceover, I vote against the president when I think he's wrong, you know, kind of thing. Has been going on, as you said, he's got a very well-funded campaign. They're not lacking money right now.
Right.
And, it's almost certainly moved the needle, right, in terms of what we saw in terms of the number of uncommitted Democratic voters that we saw in the last week of August.
And I think that's really the fundamental and key point to understand here, right, is that that's right. This has moved the needle in particular among Democratic voters, right? There's no indication in any of the polling that we've done, on this race over the last year that you see
Republicans going, you know what? I hate Ted Cruz. So I'm going to vote for Colin Allred.
Yeah, sorry. That's nowhere in the data. Again, Republicans are very happy with Ted Cruz. They're very likely to support him. And, what this race looks like, and honestly, this is what most, national elections, it's a mobilization game, right? Republicans can turn out their voters. They're very likely to win the election because, on both, both levels, because that's what they've done in the past. They've shown that they have enough voters and that they have the ability to turn them out at a rate that Democrats are unable to at this point, right? So,
but Democrats are now pouring a lot of resources into this, and we'll see, if pouring those resources in addition, I would say in addition to the advertising, also, creates more ground game.
Yeah, and I think this is where the tricky part is it's easy to look at the polling data and to draw a line, through Allred's support and say, well, clearly he's got, quote unquote momentum, which is in and of itself a complicated idea. But the idea here is that something is happening, the race is sort of shifting in his direction. And that's the way the language works too, right? I mean, when the Cook Political Report shifts its I'm putting that in quotes, shifts its designation of the race from, likely Republican to lean Republican, people innately say, oh, this is moving in Allred's direction, or, oh, this is slipping away from Cruz. But again, I'm just going to caution against that interpretation at this point, only because what we're really seeing is we're seeing the Democratic voters who have not been paying attention to this for a year and a half, who are now starting to see ads all the time, who are now, getting mailers, the block walking's going on. They're saying, oh, yeah, and we like to, the way we joke about this or talk about this, you get reminded why you're a Democrat. You get reminded why you're a Republican. And then, this kind of gets us back into what we're looking at here, which is, the spread when we look at all the polling that we've seen, especially in the last month, which you're kind of getting to, is, Cruz leading by somewhere, except for one outlier poll, Cruz leading by somewhere between 2 and 5 points.
Right. But I think the data point we want to look at, too, I want to add to that is, as of our August poll, in the trial ballot, there were about 20% of Democrats were uncommitted.
Right.
Either said, haven't made up my mind, or someone else.
Yeah.
And when we looked at the favorability rating of Allred, even a little higher than that, I think it was about 24% or so, were in those two kind of, either I'm neutral or I don't know.
Right.
And so there is some share of people, and I think we said in the poll release, at that time you could call that, you could argue that either way for Colin Allred.
Yeah.
He's got room to grow.
Yeah.
And I think what we're seeing is more, there's more room to grow.
Yeah.
Or, they've still got a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
Right. Or, the two, not even or, and they've still got a lot of work to do if they're going to close it. Well, it does seem to me that they're doing the work and they're spending the money. To your point, I guess I would say, there's another dynamic that I would layer on top of your, the talk about this being a mobilization election. And I think, it is going to, of course, all elections are mobilization elections to some degree, particularly now in a more ideologically sorted, polarized, blah, blah, blah. But there's another interesting thing going on here that goes back to the arc of Cruz's trajectory, which is, if you look at recent elections, I mean, sure, statewide Republican candidates have aired a mixture of red meat, more targeted to the Republican base mobilization ads, coupled with negative advertising against whoever the opponent was, thinking about, the Greg Abbott immigration-based
the
ads,
murders,
things like that. And with a little bit of more business development, more what you might think of as a more mainstream appeal. One of the things that's very interesting about this campaign to me is that the candidate-based ads, not the attack, bracket off the attack ads, which are something different, but the candidate-based ads in both campaigns are both moving toward the middle.
Yeah.
And that is a little bit different, right? I mean, we've expected Democrats to have to move closer to the middle because they have to make up for the deficit that you're talking about. But I think the interesting factor here is it's been a while since I've seen an election in Texas where the gravity of the middle is quite as powerful as it seems right now in this Senate campaign. And I think one of the keys to that is looking at the uncommitted voters and looking at independents.
Yeah.
There's none of those cases where, if you listen to this podcast regularly, A, you might need help, I don't know. But B, you've heard this before, for the first 10 or 15 years that I was involved in, you could safely ignore independents.
Yeah.
And campaigns, I think, safely, particularly Republican campaigns, ignored independents and moderates. Mm-hmm. If you look at the numbers among independents and moderates, and they're not the same thing, but starting with independents, Allred is running stronger among independents. Now, again, 9% or 8 or 9%, I think, of our last sample, usually not more than 11 to 14%. Not a big share, a group that we expect to break disproportionately among true independents in a Republican direction.
Yeah.
And it's not looking like that in the Cruz-Allred race. Now, that's going to move around because they're independents.
Right.
But I mean, that is another interesting factor in terms of our kind of like, look, this is a mobilization election. There is a little something else going on out there that, I think you've pointed out in terms of, Republican efforts in the Valley, which are part PRs. I think you were talking about this on the podcast a couple weeks ago. I agree with that. But also part, trying to carve out a little more attention to finer slivers of the electorate than we were seeing 10 or 12 years ago. And I think we're seeing that in really stark terms in this Allred Cruz race. And it speaks to, the part of the Cruz trajectory that we didn't mention, which is, the clearly calculated effort by the Cruz campaign that started a year and a half ago. If you go back and see the earliest stories, clearly being encouraged by the Cruz campaign about how Ted Cruz now loves to work with Democrats.
Yeah. He's really more bipartisan than you know.
Yeah. And I think that's another interesting overlay to our assumption about, the mobilization part of the election, which again is the predominant part of this.
Yeah.
But I think it's one of the hangovers from 2018 if you're in the Cruz campaign. Hey, maybe we need to pay a little bit more attention to these smaller chunks of voters. And it speaks to the larger discussion that you've been doing all this county level research on in terms of what's going on in Texas in terms of partisanship.
Yeah. I think, it's interesting. I think, the way you set that up is interesting. And it is kind of in some ways both things. What's interesting is that the way that Texas's increasing competitiveness is manifesting itself, right? And part of it is that we spend most of these podcasts talking about the role of the Republican primary in sort of setting the agenda of the politics of the state. And, we have this interesting system, right, where that happens, right? Then we have these elections, and then we have all the governing takes place, right, during the legislature. Then we have a break, and then this process plays out again. And what's interesting is, nothing has really changed in the Republican primary to sort of moderate the image or decisions of any sort of Republican statewide officials.
If anything, the other direction.
Exactly. If anything, it's actually moved in the other direction. It's actually getting harder, essentially to take even anything approaching a moderate position on anything, right, and then still survive a Republican primary. But that's taking place at the same time as the state is becoming more competitive, right? And so that's sort of, I think what's interesting is that, to your point, if anything, I always love to say, I say this on this podcast sometimes, and I think this is true. It's I like to watch the campaign's behavior as a way to sort of learn from their behaviors the way that they view the electorate, right? So when you're watching both Allred sort of tack to the middle, it's an acknowledgement by Allred, look, Democrats can't just turn out quote unquote liberals in Texas. Texas is not some liberal utopia. It's not the next California. That's just not going to fly here. We have plenty of data,
Yeah.
But for Cruz to then also actually make the same calculation in some ways that, hey, the guy that he has been for most of his career, really, aggressively, probably not the guy.
Not as workable as it was 10 years ago.
Not as workable as it was 10 years ago. And then to your point, there's, some of this data that kind of flows out there. And I think it speaks to a lot of the kind of what's going on right now. When we would look at, efforts by Republican state officials to tamp down registration efforts in some of these big counties. One of the things when I look at sort of the data that exists is I have to kind of imagine that if you're a a campaign professional right now looking at statewide results, there's a lot of uncertainty out there. And this is not to say I don't think Republicans are still in the comfortable position. I mean, I still think that they've got a very good chance of winning it both at the top. But you look at the numbers and it just sort of says why they're nervous, right?
Yeah.
And so just a couple of these numbers, just to give an example, if we just look overall, if we look at, I'm just using 2012 as a baseline, right? So 2012 versus 2020, looking at these presidential races, and we look at the change in votes. Overall, between those two elections, Republicans gained about 1.3 million total votes between 2012 and 2020. Democrats have gained 1.95 million, so about 650,000 additional votes. Where did those votes come from? Mostly from the big six counties. Republicans gained 300,000 votes in those counties. Democrats gained about 1.1 million votes in those counties. In the suburbs, Republicans have gained a little over 500,000. Democrats have gained a little over 625,000. The only place where Republicans win out on this is in the rural parts of the state, where they've actually increased their vote total by about 300,000 to about only 48,000 for Democrats. So this is to say, just in and of itself, you say like, okay, well, you can see, these are sort of the big picture. It's getting more competitive. This is what it looks like, right? And then we've talked about this a couple times. This blows people away. Sometimes I bring this up. I say, in Harris County, where all this focus is and where a lot of the registrations are taking place just generally because of its contribution to the state population, Mitt Romney lost that county by 971 votes, which I think blows people's minds when you say it. Trump lost it by 162,000 votes in 2016 and by 217,000 votes in 2020. When we look at the other big counties, we don't have to go through all of them. But this pattern repeats itself. And so I think when you're saying like, why the sudden interest in what Bexar County is doing to register people or what Travis County, this is what it is, because I think in some ways, if you look at these same trend lines that we're looking at here, I actually think these are somewhat more meaningful in a lot of ways than the polling trend lines, because I think of everything we've talked about, this is where the uncertainty actually comes from. It's, what is turnout going to look like in Texas, but also what's it going to look like in Harris, Bexar, Travis, Dallas, and Tarrant counties? Yeah. What's that vote split going to look like? And for Republicans, to the extent that they are investing money in South Texas, really what they're investing money is in rural parts. I mean, this is trying to maximize their share of the rural vote. And I think the other thing that I just sort of, putting together the various pieces and strands that are sort of coming together and sort of thinking about politics over the last few weeks, it also is hard not to think about the role that state level organizing is going to have in all of this. I mean, one of the interesting things going into this election is the extent to which the Republican Party organization in the state is in a much weaker position than it has historically been in. And that really is that has an impact down ballot. I mean, that's where, in terms of giving money to the county parties, giving money to local candidates, you expect the state party to kind of have a role in that. And right now the state party is a little bit in disarray still. And from what you can tell, there's a lot of complaints coming from Republican county chairs about sort of the money that's coming out.
Well, and I think, one of the things that's been interesting in looking at some of the campaign finance reporting that's come out of this and looking at some of the data, and we need to probably dig some of this out, I think, over time, which is that you're seeing a lot of people this cycle giving money directly to the county parties and bypassing the state party.
Yeah.
Right. And look, I don't want to pick on the Republicans solely, but it's not like the Democratic Party apparatus is not subject to a lot of criticism and a lot of dissatisfaction among Democrats.
Yeah.
Not all of that. I think if anything, because of the sharp ideological tenor of the split in the Republican Party and the way that, the Republican Party of Texas as an organization has become kind of another quasi-organization on the far right in the Republican universe, we're hearing more about that.
Yeah,
and people are just more used to the state Democratic Party being, underfunded and ineffectual.
Yeah, and I think that's what's interesting about this moment. Again, I don't think it's really going to matter. But I mean, going back and then looking forward. I mean, going back, not to be like, the political science, but I mean, when the political science looks at sort of, the Republican sort of reascendance in the South, a lot of, that also looks at the role of party organizations and the professionalization of Republican county party organizations and the important role that played in the party. And then right now, you kind of look at, again, just this moment where we are, and I see, and it's hard for me not to look at that story and look at sort of the, probably $10 million plus that Democrats are looking to throw into Texas right now, and the $1 million that, Republicans are advertising spending in South Texas. And to some extent, it's odd. I mean, to your point, it's odd to see Republicans tacking to the middle, in a general election, the way that we're seeing. It's also odd to sort of even be talking about the Republican Party organization as somehow underfunded or unprepared or, less than, because we're so used to doing that with the Democrats here.
Right. Well, and I think that, it's not like Republicans are lacking money in the state. It's just that the channels for that money are different. And, we're not even touching on, the politics and the political economy of the campaign consultant class.
Yeah.
And that layer and, and it's, political science. I mean, we know that there has been a shift towards these campaign organizations, towards consultants, towards, and that is a huge center of gravity. But that competition is also subject to the cleavages within the party, and that we're seeing in the Republican Party as well. I think we stumbled upon a good topic for another time to talk about this some more. But so to wind this up, I mean, I think we've hit a lot of the things we kind of wanted to hit on. Yeah. I mean, I think the natural thing would be for people to say, hey, how about a prediction? Having been, dinged by my colleague Brian Jones as part of the collective judgment yesterday in that government department panel for, being too locked up in predictions and not being institutional enough. But and I don't want to make a prediction in this race, but I do think that, I will be interested, obviously, in seeing our next set of polling when we switch to our likely voter model, and when because the timing is now appropriate, and we start seeing more. I don't have any doubt the trend line is so clear, and I'll be shocked if we don't see, the number of undecideds or the people that seem like they haven't made a judgment call about Colin Allred, not, go down pretty significantly in our next poll.
Yeah.
And what that's going to look like as other people begin to make up their mind a little bit more, and we'll probably do a force in this poll and all this kind of thing. So, but, I think it's fair to feel like this race probably is in single digits as of now. And I think one of the things I've been, because we're talking about resources, it's hard not to think back, again to 2018, when there was a coordinated last-minute push to turn out Republican voters on Election Day based on Republican concerns about where the early voting turnout was high, that weekend between the end of early voting and the Tuesday of in-person voting.
Yeah.
And I don't know what it's going to look like because early voting hasn't started, but I think you have to expect that Republicans, because of the fundraising advantage, the experience, the advantage of incumbencies, the advantages of incumbency, that we will see another last-minute push like that is well coordinated and well funded. But to the earlier discussion, the vehicle for that in 2018 was not mainly the parties; it was the campaigns of the statewide. I'm sure there was coordination with the statewide party, but the impetus for that came from decisions made among the statewide candidates, with the governor in the lead.
Yeah,
and his campaign in the lead.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, to the extent that we haven't had like a podcast just directly on this Senate race, even though this has actually generated a lot of attention, and it's, in some ways, I can't help but sort of look at it almost from my own perspective as like, why haven't we talked about this, yet?
And we have. We just haven't dedicated a whole podcast.
No, that's what I mean, though. But just dedicate the whole time to it. And I think, to some extent, waiting for the race to mature and kind of see what happens. I think, there's that piece of it. But what I think is also interesting is that, the fact that it's not super interesting. I mean, it is, right? This is an interesting race, and it's interesting over the horizon and the time period. But in some ways, if Cruz ends up winning this race by, let's say 3 to 6 points, somewhere between where he won last time and where Trump won last time, let's just say, right? Democrats will be disappointed. Cruz will be fine with it. He doesn't care, right? He'll win. He'll move on. He'll have done better than he did last time. But clearly, it's another dot on the trend line. Right. Yeah. And it's another thing where you say, what's a normal Texas election look like? And I mean, it just wasn't that long ago that we were looking at 20-point gaps.
Right. And I mean, to the point of Democrats being disappointed, a lot of Democrats will be very disappointed. But I also think a lot of Democrats are already talking about 2026 and jumping in the statewide races in 2026. And, if we stay on the trend line or even stable from the last couple of cycles, we are going to see very crowded primaries, in both sides in 2026. And I apologize to everybody for raising 2026 already. But, I think, if this all shakes out the way it looks right now, and we see low to medium single digit wins by Republicans at the presidential and the Senate level, and, more or less stasis in the legislature, buckle up for 2026. That would be my view. So with that, thanks for being here today, Josh. As always, thanks to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin. All this data and much, much more at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.